In 1974, a 19-year-old woman was kidnapped from her apartment in California by a radical group called the Symbionese Liberation Army, or SLA. They held her captive in a closet for about 2 months, and they controlled every aspect of her life, including when she could go to the bathroom, when she could eat, and when she could bathe. They indoctrinated her with their belief system, and they sexually abused her. At the end of this 2-month period, she was given the option to leave, but she chose to stay and join the group. She adopted their ideologies, publicly stated that she was not being held captive, and she robbed banks for them. Eventually, she was arrested. Onlookers believe that this was a woman in control of herself, making her own decisions, because that's how it appeared. Even court specialists initially thought she was guilty, and she spent time in prison before experts in brainwashing, mind control, Stockholm Syndrome, and the intricacies of how a human's will can be thwarted were brought on. After the full dynamics of the situation were understood, she was released from prison. Many of you have heard her story before. Her name is Patty Hearst, and her story is one of the most well-known stories about Stockholm Syndrome, where victims develop paradoxical feelings of loyalty towards their abusers and choose to stay with them. The lines between victim and perpetrator are blurred as the truth gets blurred by layers of lies and confusion. Now imagine being exposed to brainwashing, torture, and the manipulation of attachment needs since birth, where the captors and the abusers are your own family. The perpetrators are your family. My name is Iain Bryson, and in the last 3 weeks that I was with my first wife and our daughter, she told me that she has Stockholm Syndrome. She told me that her family's a cult, and she told me that she would be taking our daughter back to them because of mind control. And then she did, and I haven't seen my daughter since late December 2010. I'm not coming to you as an expert, but as a father who loves his daughter and has been fighting for her for over 14 years. My overall goal for this presentation is to build awareness on complex issues such as familial human trafficking and organized and ritual abuse. I'll be sharing my story, talking about the signs that I missed up to the abduction of my daughter and how cults get away with abducting children. I'll also be exploring some solutions to these complex issues. Luke 8:17 says, "For nothing is secret that will not be revealed, nor anything hidden that will not be known and come to the light." Familial human trafficking operates in darkness, and darkness can't survive when it's brought to the light. It's only effective when it's hidden. We're in a time of great exposure of these evils, as evidenced by conferences like these and the fact that so many survivors are telling their stories and being heard. In 2003, I graduated from the University of Connecticut with a master's degree in political science, and I was wondering what I was going to do next. In 2004, my first wife walked into my life. She was visiting the United States on a 3-month visa, and it was love at first sight as soon as I saw her. It wasn't long before she took a ring off her finger and told me to ask her to marry me, and I did, and at that point I was committed. She moved in with me, and we made plans to get her visa and get married in the United States. From the beginning, there were a lot of problems and oddities. She had no memory of her childhood. When I asked her about her father, she told me that the nicest thing that he ever did for her was to bring her 1 cup of tea. I know that sounds odd, and it sounded odd to me, and I had long discussions with my first wife asking her how that could be the nicest thing that her father ever did for her, and telling her that it sounded like she was lying to me or leaving something out. But nevertheless, she kept telling me that the nicest thing he ever did for her was bring her 1 cup of tea. She experienced very high highs and very low lows, and she often hated me. And that was something else I thought she was lying about, because she could go one day from loving me to the next hating me. It was hard for me to believe that one person can feel both extremes and that they could both be real. I have a journal from 2004 and 2005 where I'm writing down her traits and trying to figure out what's going on with her. My initial thoughts were that she had some trauma-related disorder. I thought that it matched some of the symptoms of borderline personality disorder, and I thought that incest was probably involved. And I tried to bring up incest with her a couple of times, but she completely shut it down and wouldn't talk to me. In 2007, our daughter was born in New London, Connecticut, and she was the light of our lives. Because of her, I began to understand the meaning of life and what my purpose is. She taught me what love is, and she was everything to me. In 2008, we moved to the Netherlands to be closer to my first wife's family in Poland. In 2010, when my daughter was 3 years old, she returned from Poland with signs that she had been traumatized, signs of child abuse. She was wetting the bed, talking about her grandfather's private parts. She had bruises. She was regressing into baby talk and forgetting things that I had taught her. She began having nightmares and throwing tantrums. And every night when it was time to shower, she would scream at the top of her lungs, "Not my pee-pee, not my pee-pee." My wife told me it was a soap irritation, but I tried to tell my wife that we needed to see the doctor, that it didn't make sense that she went to Poland and came back with a soap irritation that was causing her this much terror. When I asked my first wife what was happening in Poland, she dismissed my concerns and acted like I was crazy for thinking anything could be happening in Poland. I trusted her, and I didn't believe that she could know our daughter was being abused and not tell me or do anything about it. When things were good with her, they were very good. And when things were bad, they were terrible and floored me, and I just waited for the cycle to change again. It always seemed to me that the times that my first wife was healthiest were the times that she was away from Poland the longest. I often thought that she was healing, and then she would return to Poland on a visit and come back, and she would revert to the low lows again. And I couldn't figure it out. In the summer of 2010, we decided to move our family back to the United States, but my first wife was unable to return to the United States until we could get her a visa. So we applied for her visa, and then I decided that I would go ahead to the United States to look for work and a place for us to live. I also decided that it would be best if my first wife and our daughter went back to Poland for support in my absence. I completely overlooked the fact that the last time they had returned from Poland, they had returned with signs of trauma. I couldn't believe that my first wife would revert back to that again because she was so happy and so healthy, and she wanted to move to the United States with our family. We were apart for 3 months, and in that time we talked at least daily, and there were no signs that anything had changed, and every day she told me how much she loved me and that she couldn't wait for us to be back together again. On December 8th, she wrote, "I can't wait to be home tomorrow. Love you loads and loads. Kisses, your girls." And on December 9th, I arrived back at our apartment in The Hague to meet them. I couldn't wait to see them, and I ran from the airport to the train, then from the train to the tram, and from the tram to our apartment building. But immediately when I laid my eyes on them, I knew that something was wrong. They were in some sort of a funk. A couple minutes later, I tried to kiss my first wife, and she jumped away and said, "Ouch." She said, "I hate you, and I've always hated you. I'm taking our daughter back to Poland for either Christmas or New Year's." I was stunned, but I had seen this sort of switch in her before, and I told her that I wasn't going to be fooled this time. I began begging her to get help. That's when she started saying things like, "I have something like Stockholm Syndrome, and my family is a cult, and I'm taking our daughter back to Poland because of mind control." I had no idea what she could mean by these things. Over the course of the 3 weeks that we were together after I returned from the United States and they returned from Poland, there were many strange and scary things that happened. My first wife pretty much just stayed in bed with a migraine and told me that she wanted me to spend this time with my daughter. She kept telling me that she was taking her back to Poland. I kept telling her, "No, we need to get help." She told me that there was a plan to take my daughter back to Poland, that God doesn't approve of our marriage, and that her dad had created a red herring, and that my drug, psychological, and criminal histories would be used against me. She told me that I would never see my daughter again, and that nobody was going to believe me when I tried to get help. Our daughter had all of the same signs of trauma that she had had after their previous visit to Poland. Again, she was talking about her grandfather's private parts. Again, she had the same fear that someone was going to touch her pee-pee when it was shower time, and again she had bruises. Even with all these signs, I could not believe that my wife could be a part of or know that my daughter was being abused. This was impossible to me, and so it allowed me to create a barrier where there were signs, but I still couldn't really see them or think about them. I spent the last 3 weeks that my family was together taking care of my daughter during the day and trying to convince my first wife to get help at night. I used logical arguments like, we know that you have trauma in your past, and we know that you think it's affected our family. How do you know that it's not a large effect? Why do you think it's a small effect and we don't need to get help? I told her that we knew something happened in her childhood and we knew she had no memory of her childhood, so maybe this was a big thing and we should at least explore it. I also tried to appeal to her motherly instincts by telling her that as our daughter's father, I was worried and that therefore it was better for our daughter if we got her evaluated. But she kept telling me, no, it's only soap irritation, nothing's happening, and at the same time telling me I'm taking our daughter back to the cult in Poland. I went to a psychologist that knew us both, and I told her that she was threatening to leave the country with our daughter, and I told him that she was holding on to her passport, but he tried to reassure me that could not happen because it would be illegal, and he told me also that he was going to try to get in touch with her because he was worried. Eventually, I went to the police and told them that my wife was threatening to leave the country and that she had our daughter's passport. But the police told me that there was nothing that they could do, and they handed me a pre-printed list of family law attorneys. I was terrified, and I kept begging my first wife to get help. I took pictures of her when she was in bed, telling her that she looked like a trauma victim, and said, "Can't you see that we need help?" After about 3 weeks of being together, on December 27th, I spent the entire day playing outside with my daughter in the snow. We went to a couple parks around our apartment, and we went to a farm down the street, and eventually we went back home for dinner. When we arrived, my wife was dressed and ready to go for the first time in those 3 weeks, and she told me that she wanted to take our daughter to the store. I immediately felt some panic as I remembered the threats to take her to Poland, and I remembered that she had our daughter's passport. And I told her to hold off and that we needed to plan what we were going to do and that we needed to go out as a family. Eventually, she was able to convince me that she was going to take our daughter to the library down the street to visit with one of our daughter's friends and her mother. I gave my daughter a hug and had to pry her little hands off my neck because she didn't want to let go. But I told her I loved her and that I would see her soon, and watched her walk down the stairs. And I never saw her again. I called a good friend for advice, and I told him that it was happening again, that my first wife was in one of her low periods, that she was telling me things that were crazy that I didn't understand, and that I was terrified. And about 10 minutes into that phone call, it hit me that they were gone, that everything that my first wife had been telling me was coming true. I knew they hadn't gone to the library. I ran through the house and saw that my daughter's blanket and stuffed animal were missing, and those weren't things that would be taken to the library. So I ran to the police department, which was about 2 blocks away. I pounded on the window because they were closed, and I told them that my wife and daughter were leaving the country and that my daughter had been abused, and that was where she was returning to. I begged them to stop them from leaving the country, and I begged them to do an evaluation. They wouldn't take a police report, and they told me that they couldn't do an evaluation on a child below the age of 4 without evidence. Of course, I didn't have evidence. My evidence was my daughter, and now she was gone. After being rejected by the police, I returned home to gather myself, to call my parents, and to figure out what the plan should be next. I eventually spoke to a U.S. duty officer at the embassy, and he told me that I needed to stop my daughter from going to Poland at all costs. He recommended that I re-abduct my daughter and get her to the embassy where they would then evaluate her. I returned to the police several more times, and I begged them to take a report, and I begged them to stop my daughter from leaving the country, but they wouldn't do either of those things for me. I spoke to the U.S. duty officer several more times, and they assured me that it was out of their jurisdiction and that they couldn't do anything, even though my daughter was a U.S. citizen. My dad flew over to help me, but one of his first acts of help was to ask a psychiatric intervention team into my apartment to assess me. When I convinced them that all I was doing was trying to figure out how to stop my daughter from going into a foreign country, they left. Then I was convinced to return to the United States to regroup with my family and get a lawyer. I flew into Boston, and my aunt and my mother picked me up and drove me to a hospital and had me involuntarily committed to a psych ward. It took me about 2 weeks to get out of this because they called and said that they were worried about me repeatedly. Eventually, they had to release me because all I was trying to do was figure out why my daughter was taken away and how to get her back. It was because I was talking about such things as ritual abuse, trauma-based mind control, and Stockholm Syndrome that my mother and aunt and other people thought I was crazy. And my first wife was talking to them behind my back and deploying the red herring, which I'll describe in more detail later. Over the next several months, I reached out to everyone I could think of, every government agency, every criminal justice institution, child protection agency. I reached out to the press, I reached out to lawyers. I was begging anybody and everybody to help. The U.S. Secretary of State told me that the legal remedy was to file under the Hague Treaty of 1980. This treaty is a multilateral treaty which seeks to protect children from harmful effects of wrongful removal and retention cases across international borders by providing a procedure to bring about their prompt return and ensuring the protection of rights of access. In other words, you can't take a child from their country where they're living into another country if both parents don't agree, which is exactly what happened in this case. I filed the paperwork, and they told me that it would take up to 2 years to process this and get this back into court. As a dad, I couldn't wait 2 years. I couldn't justify waiting 2 years knowing that what my wife told me was true, that our daughter was just taken back to a cult where she was being abused and would continue to be abused. I contemplated what to do next, and I couldn't come up with anything other than to demand that they evaluate my daughter. And since they weren't listening to my pleas through emails, I decided that I had to go to Poland and present myself and make the demand in person. I flew from Boston to Amsterdam, I rented a car, and then I drove through Germany to Poland. At first, I thought the best option would be to do what the duty officer recommended and re-abduct my daughter and get her to the embassy in Berlin. I printed out directions, thinking that this was what I would do. As I was driving to Poland, it dawned on me that this would be a crazy feat. Berlin was about an hour away from where they are, and I would have to get my then 4-year-old daughter into a car away from whatever adult was watching after her and drive her across this international border. I decided that that was untenable, and I changed to Plan B. Plan B was just to cause a commotion, to put myself in a situation where they would give me a lawyer and an interpreter, and I would be heard. I believe that no matter what the details of that were, that I would find myself being heard and that therefore there would be a child abuse investigation. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, and I did buy a hammer on the drive from Amsterdam to Poland. I had considered long and hard, what should a father do? Shouldn't I protect my daughter? Shouldn't I eliminate one person who's abusing her if I can? When it came down to it, as I was chasing him down the street with a hammer in one hand, I knew that I wasn't going to use it. He fell, and I punched him several times in the face, including making himself punch himself with keys that he was holding, but I never hit him with the hammer. I waited to be arrested, and I was sure that I would soon be speaking to someone who would initiate a child abuse investigation. The judge told me that he didn't care why I did what I did, and that there would be no child abuse investigation. He told me that the only investigation was going to be into me and what my actions were. I spent the next year and a half in pretrial prison, and I continued writing letters to everybody I could think of, to the prosecutor, to defense attorneys, to child protection agencies in Poland, to the court. None of them responded to me and were willing to initiate my one request, that my daughter be evaluated for exposure to family abuse and trafficking. I wasn't allowed to call witnesses on my behalf, and I wasn't allowed to question my wife's family about the abduction of my daughter. The only thing that the judge would allow in trial was what my actions were and whether I was guilty or not. Because they didn't do a child abuse investigation, there was no evidence of the abuse that I alleged. Therefore, when the court psychiatrists evaluated me, they did so based on the presumption that no abuse had occurred, and they decided that my belief that my daughter had been abused must be delusion. I asked them if there were any other signs of mental illness in me other than the fact that I believed my daughter had been abused and was being abused, and they told me no. But nevertheless, I was sent to one of Poland's maximum security court psychiatric hospitals. The director of this institution told me in our first conversation that it was a mistake that I was there, but that I would have to be there because that's what the court wanted, and he would have to treat me according to the desires of the court. He told me that I would have to go through a 3-tiered system from maximum security to medium security to minimum security before I would be released. And even though under Polish law they could release me that day, that he couldn't and he wouldn't, and neither would any of the other institutions, because that's not what the court wanted. They attempted to force medicate me, and I had to learn how to not take their medication to fight for my mind. I knew that I had to just stop talking about my daughter, because that was the only thing that they had on me, the only reason that they were keeping me, the only reason that they decided that I had mental illness. So if I just stopped talking about my daughter, I knew that I could cruise through the system as quickly as possible. When they sent me to the medium security facility, it was worse than the maximum security facility. The psychiatrist there decided to double the medication, saying that they weren't treating me at the previous facility, and she also decided to hold me longer than the necessary 6 months before she wrote an opinion, saying that she didn't know me well enough. This is the psychiatrist who said that nobody had known what I was talking about since day one, when I had alleged ritual abuse and mind control. So what is trauma-based mind control and ritual abuse? Lachter and Lehman, as cited in Noblet and Noblet in 2008, say that trauma-based mind control programming can be defined as systematic torture that blocks the victim's capacity for conscious processing through pain, terror, drugs, illusion, sensory deprivation, sensory overstimulation, oxygen deprivation, cold, heat, spinning, brain stimulation, and often near death, and then employs suggestion and or classical and operant conditioning consistent with well-established behavioral modification principles to implant thoughts, directives, and perceptions into the unconscious mind, often in newly formed trauma-induced dissociated identities that force the victim to do, feel, think, or perceive things for the purposes of the programmer. The objective is for the victim to follow directives with no conscious awareness, including execution of acts in clear violation of the victim's volition, moral principles, and spiritual convictions. The Relentless Hope website defines ritual abuse as usually involving repeated abuse over an extended period of time. The physical abuse is severe, sometimes including torture, rape, bestiality, human sacrifice, and cannibalism. The sexual abuse is usually painful, sadistic, and humiliating, intended as a means of gaining dominance over the victim. The psychological abuse is devastating and involves the use of ritual indoctrination. In ritual abuse, the victim is subjected to rituals or ceremonies dedicated to an entity, usually Satan or Lucifer. The term God or Lord may be used as well. In 2011, nobody who had the ability or the power to help me knew what these things were, and it made me look crazy. The Polish authorities told me that they didn't know what I was talking about. One Polish court psychiatrist told me that he had never heard of a woman who was being abused, who wouldn't or couldn't get help on her own. He told me that if what I was saying was true, then he believed it would continue to happen. And then he said, "Wouldn't it be nice if you were crazy?" This is what I was up against, so I knew that none of these people were going to help me. I knew that I just had to stop talking about my daughter and get out and then continue from there. They didn't even know what I was talking about. While I was in prison, I was served with divorce papers, which included termination of my parental rights. I appealed the divorce on the grounds that we needed to evaluate my daughter. After 50 months of incarceration, I was eventually let out in June 2015. I returned to Connecticut to my dad's farm, where I was able to get myself together and begin reading and researching and writing again. I also reached out to people, including other survivors and people who have also had their children abducted. My dad and I returned to Poland to get a lawyer to fight for my parental rights, but I lost that case too because the family court wasn't willing to reevaluate the situation or evaluate my daughter. In 2018, I met my current wife, Emily, telling her my entire story the first time that we spoke. We finished our book and published it in May of 2024. I know this story is a lot to take in. There's a lot of detail over the course of several years, and that's why I wrote a book about it. I want to go over some of the obvious and less obvious signs that there was something awry in my first wife's family. Her relationship to her father was always suspect. with the only and best memory of him being that he had brought her one cup of tea on one occasion. I suspected attachment issues when my first wife received notice that my father-in-law could not play tennis because he had hurt his elbow, and she began sobbing uncontrollably. Whenever we were in Poland as a family, she would tell me, "When I'm in Poland, I'm not with you. When I'm in Poland, I am my dad's." One of my biggest regrets is trusting my first wife and her family unconditionally with my daughter. Even though she had classic signs of child abuse, I was blind to this because I trusted them and couldn't see how anyone would love my daughter any differently than I did. There were oddities in my first wife's family that I chalked up to them being Polish. Alcoholism was rampant. My father-in-law once told me that he likes young boobies. My wife's grandfather once asked me how she was in bed. And there was a general misery and also a panicky, scared feeling that I had whenever I was around them. Parental alienation was happening right in front of my eyes. My daughter would come back from Poland and refuse to hold my hand when crossing the street. She would tell me, "Ouch, you're hurting me," when I attempted to take her hand. My first wife started crying upon my daughter entering the room in an attempt to make it seem like I was hurting her. And my daughter would ask me later, "Why do you hurt mommy?" After the abduction, there were emails from my first wife saying they were in a shelter and that they left because they were afraid for me and they had to escape for their lives. My first wife told my parents and the authorities such things as my daughter was hiding in the corner and that she didn't want to see me or speak to me. I think the main reason that I missed all this is because of my own ignorance and incredulity. I lived in a world where I didn't believe that this sort of thing was close enough to me to bother caring about. I trusted my first wife entirely, and even though I didn't know that this thing existed, I also didn't believe that even a minor thing was possible. I didn't believe that my daughter could be being spanked without my knowledge or yelled at without my knowledge. I believed that my first wife cared for and had the same vision for caring for our daughter that I did. I thought everyone would view and love my daughter the way that I did. I couldn't picture a scenario where anyone in the family would hurt our daughter intentionally. I get a lot of criticism, understandably, in this area. Why didn't I do anything? Why didn't I listen to my daughter? Why didn't I see the obvious signs? And in hindsight, it's clear, and it looks ridiculous. And that's why I've tried to list the reasons why I didn't see it. I think primarily being incredulity. I didn't think that this could happen. I didn't think that my daughter could be being abused, and I certainly didn't think that my wife could have anything to do with such a thing. Because of this underlying belief, the possibility was just out of the realm of possibilities, and so the signs didn't matter. I couldn't focus on the signs. I couldn't sort the signs because the conclusion the signs were leading to didn't exist and couldn't exist in the world that I envisioned. Another reason that I couldn't see it was because of my own unhealed traumas. I had traumas buried deep within myself that I couldn't even remember until my daughter started exhibiting signs that she had been traumatized. When this occurred, I was fascinated that I was remembering my own trauma, but I still couldn't imagine that it could be possible that my daughter was being traumatized. Familial human trafficking and organized and ritual abuse are not rare, as evidenced by the many survivor testimonies that are coming out. So how do cults get away with abducting children? Well, public ignorance is a main factor, including law enforcement, government agencies, and medical professionals. Things like Stockholm Syndrome, DID, and ritual and cult abuse are simply not on their radar. If you Google ritual abuse or satanic ritual abuse, it will redirect to satanic panic, saying that none of this is real and that there's no point in looking any further, that it's been decided. The proof of the matter is that these survivors are coming out more and more and speaking about the atrocities that they have endured. We need to pay attention to what they are saying. Public belief systems also aid cults in abducting children. Things like stranger danger are an example. People have been indoctrinated to believe that the most dangerous person is the guy in the white van, when in reality, families are who are doing the biggest atrocities. The belief system that mothers are safer than fathers also played a big role in the abduction of my child. Cults count on allegations of cult abuse sounding crazy and unbelievable. I spoke about a red herring before and how it was used to guarantee that nobody would believe me and I wouldn't get any help. Red herring is originally derived from a strong odor made from smoked herring that was used to distract hunting dogs off the trail of the game and on a phony trail. It is now used as a literary term to define a distraction or a deception that takes one's attention from the point of interest to other points of interest that are irrelevant but latch on to the reader's attention. In the case of my child's abduction, the red herring was used as simply a distraction, a sort of a smokescreen to say, hey, look at him and how crazy and bad he is, and don't pay any attention to what's going on over here as we take this child from one country to another. And then me beating up my father-in-law just helped to feed into the narrative that I was the bad guy. I realized that that wasn't the best option, but in retrospect, given what I was faced and the facts that were upon me and the fact that I had already waited 4 months, I don't beat myself up too bad about that. Cults are able to hide in plain sight. There's a great quote in Michael Salter's book, Organized Sexual Abuse. In their research and clinical experience, therapists Bentovim and Tranter in 1994 have found that families harboring cultures of sexual abuse are of two types: openly dysfunctional and well known to welfare agencies, or closed systems unknown to the authorities and isolated from their surrounding communities. Whilst both kinds of families place a high premium on loyalty and secrecy, abuse within openly dysfunctional family types is more likely to be detected due to their contact with police and health and welfare services. In contrast, organized abuse within apparently normal families who are not dependent on government assistance can go unnoticed for many years, if at all. The children of these families are afforded few opportunities to disclose their abuse or to seek external intervention. I believe that my first wife used me as an avenue to disclose her abuse, and she has no other avenues to disclose it or to seek intervention. Cults also get away with this sort of thing because cult members are in high places. My father-in-law works for the city, is friends with the president of the city, is friends with the judge who held my trial, and is in high esteem in his city. Therefore, he is almost unreachable from his local community, and that protects him from any investigation taking place. Cults create dissociated personalities that they are in control of. There were times where I couldn't tell if my first wife was the same person as she was yesterday, and I had to look for marks on her body to convince myself that this was actually my wife. My first wife tried to disclose to me. She told me what was happening. She was very explicit about what was happening, but she couldn't do anything about it. Even in telling me that she was taking our daughter back to a cult because of mind control, she actually went through with it. And this is because of the trauma that leads to dissociation. Those personalities are under control of the programmer. I believe that my first wife wants to get out of this cult, that her actions speak volumes, and that even though she is a part of it, that is understandable given the nature of ritual abuse and trauma-based mind control. They are waiting for us. I want to reflect on some things that I would have done differently in hindsight. Moving to a foreign country made my family more vulnerable because I didn't know how things worked and I didn't have a strong community around me. I wouldn't have trusted people blindly with my child, nor would I have sent my wife and daughter back to Poland. I would have taken my daughter to the doctor as soon as there were signs of abuse, and I wouldn't have worried about how that looked to my wife or worried about betraying her. I would have taken my first wife and our daughter's words more seriously, even though I didn't understand what they could be talking about. A small-scale solution is to err on the side of believing. If a friend or family member reveals to you details that are too complex or you can't understand, err on the side of believing them. Take them seriously. Look into it further. Evaluate the child. Don't think that something like this can't happen to you or those close to you. We need to take responsibility for our own education on these matters, which you are doing by attending a conference like this. But it needs to go further. We need to take this and talk about it with our friends and family. This subject cannot be taboo, and we cannot continue to think it doesn't exist or that it's too far away for us to worry about. On a larger scale, the cases that involve this sort of thing and the laws that we make to govern them have to put the interest of the child first. That must come before everything else. A child-centric approach would cut away the utility of the red herring. It would eliminate the he said, she said, because all signs in the child-centric approach would point back to the child and evaluating that child. The Hague Treaty, which is supposed to prevent and deal with international parental child abductions, didn't do that, telling me as a father to wait 2 years to deal with the abduction of my daughter to a cult was unreasonable. Authorities and medical professionals need to be trained to deal with the extremes. We cannot remain ignorant of cult abuse, ritual abuse, and trauma-based mind control. These have to be on the radar of those who are evaluating our children and evaluating situations involving our children. There is more training today on the identification of human trafficking than there was 14 plus years ago when I first started dealing with this. Ritual abuse can be harder, more difficult to detect, but it is not impossible. Our children are worth everything we have and more. They are our hope and they are the reason for everything. We must declare a war on child abuse. There is a lot of positive progress that has occurred since my daughter was abducted. Many more people are talking about this. Many survivors are telling their stories. Conferences are being held. People are talking about it, and people want to make change. When I first started seeking help, I couldn't find anybody who knew what I was talking about who was in a position of power. The psychologist that I told that my wife was threatening to abduct our daughter and held her passport told me 2 things: that she couldn't abduct my daughter because it would be illegal, and then he told me the parable of the stone. He told me that in the parable, a large stone is blocking a man's path, and so he takes up a sledgehammer to hit the stone because it has to be removed for him to get through. The people onlooking look at this man and think that what he's doing is ridiculous because he keeps swinging the stone and there is no effect visibly. Nevertheless, he keeps swinging the stone and the townspeople keep thinking this man is crazy. They believe that he must be delusional. But nevertheless, he keeps swinging the stone until one day it shatters, because what they can't see are that each swing is creating tiny cracks inside that eventually create cracks large enough to turn this stone into a pile of rubble. I'm going to keep swinging at the stone, and I invite you to pick up your sledgehammer as well. Many people swinging from different angles help this process to go quicker. We all want to see the stone that is organized abuse and familial human trafficking shatter, and I believe that together we will make that happen. That is what's happening. Together, we are strong.